Imagine floating alone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, nothing but water in every direction for as far as the eye can see, no boat beneath your feet, no land in sight, no one coming to save you. Now imagine staying alive out there, not for a day, not for a week, but for 76 brutal days, drifting nearly 1,800 miles across one of the most unforgiving stretches of ocean on the planet. This is not a movie. This is not fiction. This is the true story of a man named Steve Callahan, and what he endured is one of the most extraordinary survival accounts in maritime history, a story so intense that even seasoned sailors find it hard to believe it actually happened. In January of 1982, Callahan set sail alone across the Atlantic, an experienced sailor and boat designer confident in his skills and his vessel. But the ocean does not care about experience. It does not care about confidence. In the dead of night, something struck his boat with catastrophic force, possibly a whale, tearing through the hull and flooding the cabin within moments. What followed was a desperate scramble for survival as his boat, his shelter, and everything he had built his voyage around began sinking beneath him. With only seconds to react, Callahan grabbed what he could and was thrust into a tiny inflatable life raft, alone, in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, with the vast and merciless Atlantic Ocean now his only world. What happened over the next 76 days would push one man to the absolute limits of human endurance. Armed with nothing but a damaged spear gun, failing solar stills, and sheer determination, Callahan would have to outsmart starvation, outlast dehydration, and outwit the sharks that circled beneath him, testing the fragile raft that stood between him and the deep. He would battle violent storms that threatened to capsize him in an instant, watch his own body waste away from malnutrition, and confront a kind of isolation and psychological torment that few human beings have ever experienced and survived to tell about. This is a story about more than just survival. It is a story about what happens when the human spirit refuses to break, even when everything else has been stripped away. It is about resourcefulness under impossible pressure, about the razor-thin line between life and death, and about the extraordinary willpower it takes to face down hopelessness, day after day, with no guarantee that rescue would ever come. By the end of this journey, you will understand why Steve Callahan's story continues to be studied, retold, and revered decades later as one of the greatest tests of human survival ever recorded. So stay with me, because what you are about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about the limits of human endurance. This is the incredible true story of Steve Callahan, and it begins the night his boat disappeared beneath the waves. Steve Callahan was an experienced sailor, naval architect, and boat designer who had spent much of his life around the sea, building boats and testing his skills against the unpredictable moods of the ocean. In January 1982, he set out on a solo transatlantic voyage aboard a small sloop he had designed and built himself, named the Napoleon Solo. His plan was to sail from the Canary Islands toward the Caribbean, a journey that many sailors before him had completed, but one that still carried enormous risk for a lone sailor with no crew to share the burden of watches, repairs, or emergencies. Callahan was not a reckless adventurer. He was methodical, skilled, and deeply respectful of the sea, having prepared his vessel with care and confidence in his own abilities. Yet the ocean, as countless sailors have learned throughout history, does not care about preparation, skill, or intention. It is indifferent to human plans, and it was this indifference that would soon test Callahan in ways he could never have imagined. About a week into his voyage, during a night when the seas were rough and the wind was gusting, disaster struck without warning. Something slammed into the hull of his boat with tremendous force. To this day, the exact cause remains uncertain, though it is widely believed that the Napoleon Solo collided with a whale, possibly one that was sleeping just beneath the surface, or perhaps was startled and struck the boat in a panic. Whatever the cause, the impact was catastrophic. Water began pouring into the cabin almost immediately, and Callahan, jolted awake by the collision, scrambled to assess the damage in the darkness. What he found was every solo sailor's worst nightmare. His boat was sinking, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The hull had been breached beyond repair, and the Atlantic Ocean was rushing in to claim the vessel that had been his home, his transportation, and his life's work. In the chaos of those critical moments, Callahan had to make split-second decisions that would determine whether he lived or died. He did not have the luxury of time to mourn the loss of his boat or to process the shock of what was happening. Instead, years of training and preparation took over. He managed to grab a few essential items before the boat went down, including a life raft, some emergency supplies, and a grab bag containing critical survival tools. This ability to think clearly under extreme duress, to act rather than freeze, speaks to the discipline that would define his entire ordeal. Many people, faced with the sudden and violent loss of everything they had prepared for, might panic or become paralyzed with fear. Callahan's composure in this moment, born from both his sailing experience and his natural temperament, gave him a fighting chance at survival before his story had even truly begun. As the Napoleon Solo slipped beneath the waves, Callahan found himself alone in a small inflatable life raft, adrift in the vast darkness of the Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of miles from any shipping lane, hundreds of miles from land, and utterly alone. The enormity of his situation must have been almost impossible to comprehend in those first hours. One moment he had been sailing toward a destination with a boat, supplies, and a plan. The next, he was reduced to nothing but a rubber raft and whatever meager provisions he had managed to salvage. The psychological weight of this sudden transformation, from a self-sufficient sailor in control of his journey to a helpless castaway at the mercy of ocean currents and weather, was perhaps just as dangerous as any physical threat he would face in the days to come. The disaster itself was not simply an isolated event but the opening chapter of an ordeal that would stretch on for over 2.5 months. It set the stage for everything that followed: the desperate rationing of food and water, the constant battle against the deteriorating raft, the encounters with sharks and other sea creatures, and the crushing isolation of being utterly alone on the open ocean with no guarantee of rescue. The suddenness and violence of the sinking meant that Callahan had almost no time to prepare mentally for what he was about to endure. He was thrust into survival mode instantly, forced to adapt to a reality that had changed in the span of a few terrifying minutes. What makes this moment so significant in the broader arc of his story is that it illustrates a universal truth about disaster and survival. Catastrophe often arrives without warning, and how a person responds in those first critical moments can shape everything that follows. Callahan's ability to salvage what he could, to keep his wits about him, and to accept the reality of his situation rather than being consumed by despair, set the foundation for the remarkable feat of endurance that was still ahead of him. The loss of the Napoleon Solo was devastating, but it was also the beginning of a story of extraordinary human resilience, one that would eventually captivate readers around the world when Callahan chronicled his experience in his memoir. The disaster was not the end of his story, but rather the dramatic and terrifying doorway through which he entered into one of the most remarkable survival tales in maritime history. When Steve Callahan's boat, the Napoleon Solo, disappeared beneath the waves of the Atlantic, he was left with only what he had managed to grab in those frantic final moments before the sinking. What he salvaged would become the entire foundation of his survival for the next 76 days, and the story of how he used, adapted, and stretched these meager resources is one of the most compelling aspects of his ordeal. Unlike a shipwreck survivor who might wash ashore with access to a wrecked vessel's remains, Callahan was confined to a small inflatable life raft, drifting in open ocean, with nothing beyond what fit inside his emergency grab bag and whatever he could improvise from the materials at hand. The tools he had were basic, imperfect, and in many cases barely functional, yet his ability to use them with ingenuity and discipline became the difference between life and death. Among the most critical items he managed to save was a spear gun, a simple but vital tool that would become his primary means of obtaining food throughout his ordeal. In the vast emptiness of the ocean, food was never guaranteed, and Callahan quickly realized that his survival would depend on his ability to catch fish. The spear gun allowed him to hunt the marine life that gathered beneath and around his raft, particularly the dorado, or mahi-mahi, that were drawn to the shade and shelter his raft provided. These fish became his main source of sustenance, but catching them was neither easy nor safe. He had to time his strikes carefully, conserve his limited number of spears, and avoid damaging the fragile raft in the process, since a single accidental puncture could have been fatal. Every successful catch was both a victory and a reminder of how precarious his situation truly was, since a missed shot meant a wasted spear and a missed opportunity for food that might not come again for days. Water was an equally pressing concern, and here Callahan relied on solar stills, a device designed to desalinate seawater using the heat and evaporation created by sunlight. These stills were far from perfect. They were fragile, prone to leaking, and required constant attention and maintenance to function even marginally well. Several of them failed over the course of his journey, either through wear and tear or damage from the harsh marine environment, leaving him to rely on an ever-dwindling number of functioning stills to produce enough fresh water to survive. The process was slow and unreliable, often yielding only small amounts of drinkable water each day, forcing Callahan into a constant state of rationing and careful calculation. He had to balance his body's need for hydration against the reality that he had no way of knowing how many more days or weeks he might be adrift, which meant every sip had to be weighed against an uncertain future. Beyond the spear gun and solar stills, Callahan had managed to salvage some food supplies, navigation charts, and a few other emergency items, though these were limited and quickly consumed or rendered less useful as the days wore on. His navigation tools became particularly important, as understanding his approximate position and the direction of ocean currents gave him a sense of purpose and possibility, a way to believe that drifting was not simply aimless suffering but part of a journey that might eventually bring him closer to shipping lanes or land. This knowledge, however limited, allowed him to maintain hope and to make what small decisions he could about his situation, even when he had no real control over the raft's movement through the water. What stands out most about this phase of his survival story is not simply the tools themselves, but the extraordinary resourcefulness and adaptability Callahan demonstrated in using them. He was constantly repairing, improvising, and problem-solving, patching the raft when it began to deteriorate, devising new methods to increase his chances of catching fish, and finding ways to stretch every drop of water and every scrap of food as far as possible. His background as a naval architect and boat designer proved invaluable here, giving him a technical understanding of materials, mechanics, and problem-solving that an average person might not have possessed. He approached each failing piece of equipment not with despair but with the mindset of an engineer determined to find a solution, even when the odds seemed impossibly stacked against him. This period of his ordeal reveals a fundamental truth about survival in extreme circumstances. It is rarely about having ideal equipment or perfect conditions, but about maximizing the value of whatever limited resources are available. Callahan's spear gun was worn and imperfect, his solar stills were unreliable and prone to failure, yet he managed to sustain himself through sheer persistence, careful management, and creative problem-solving. Every day presented new challenges, from equipment malfunctions to the physical toll of malnutrition and dehydration, yet he continued to adapt, refusing to give in to the despair that surely threatened to overwhelm him. The tools he carried were not glamorous or advanced, but in his hands, they became instruments of survival, extending his life day by day in a situation where the odds of rescue seemed impossibly slim. This resourcefulness with minimal means would prove to be one of the defining characteristics of his entire ordeal, setting the stage for the remarkable endurance he would need to survive over 2.5 months alone at sea. 76 days is an almost incomprehensible length of time to imagine spending alone on a small inflatable life raft in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, yet this was the reality that Steve Callahan faced after the sinking of the Napoleon Solo. To put this span of time into perspective, it is longer than 2.5 months, a period during which most people go about the daily routines, work their jobs, spend time with family, and experience the comfort and predictability of life on solid ground. Callahan, by contrast, spent every single one of those days confined to a raft roughly the size of a small inflatable pool toy, drifting across nearly 1,800 miles of open ocean, with no guarantee that any single day would not be his last. The sheer duration of his ordeal transformed his story from a tale of a dramatic accident into an extraordinary test of long-term human endurance, one that pushed the limits of what the human body and mind can withstand. The distance he covered during this time was staggering in itself. Drifting at the mercy of ocean currents and wind patterns, Callahan had no ability to steer his raft in any meaningful way toward land or shipping routes. He was entirely at the mercy of the Atlantic's currents, which happened to carry him in a generally westward direction, slowly but surely, moving him across a vast stretch of open water toward the Caribbean. This lack of control over his own trajectory added a profound psychological burden to his physical suffering. He could not simply decide to head toward the nearest island or plot a course to safety. Instead, he had to trust that the currents would eventually carry him somewhere survivable, all while having no way of knowing how long that might take or whether it would happen before his supplies, or his body, gave out completely. Each day during those 76 days brought its own set of challenges, and the monotony of his situation was punctuated by moments of sheer terror and moments of fragile hope. He had to contend with the physical deterioration of his raft, which was never designed to withstand such prolonged use in harsh marine conditions. The constant exposure to salt water, sun, and the physical stress of the open ocean caused the raft to develop leaks and structural weaknesses that Callahan had to repair repeatedly, often using makeshift tools and materials, knowing that a catastrophic failure of the raft would mean almost certain death. This ongoing battle to keep his only shelter functional added an exhausting layer of vigilance to his daily existence, as he could never fully relax or feel secure, always aware that the raft keeping him alive was slowly falling apart beneath him. Sharks became a recurring and terrifying presence throughout his time adrift, circling his raft and occasionally bumping or attacking it, testing the fragile barrier between Callahan and the predators of the deep. These encounters were a constant reminder of his vulnerability, alone and exposed in an environment that was not designed for human survival. Beyond the sharks, he had to endure extreme weather conditions, including storms that threatened to capsize or destroy his raft entirely, as well as relentless sun exposure that caused physical deterioration to his skin and overall health. His body began to waste away as malnutrition and dehydration took their toll, and he documented significant weight loss and physical decline as the weeks stretched into months, his body consuming itself in the absence of adequate nutrition. What makes the length of his ordeal particularly remarkable is the psychological endurance it demanded. Unlike a short-term crisis that might be survived through a burst of adrenaline and determination, 76 days required Callahan to sustain his will to live over an extended and uncertain period, without knowing when, or if, rescue would ever come. Each day that passed without sighting a ship or any sign of land represented another test of his resolve, another opportunity for despair to creep in and threaten to overwhelm him. He had to find ways to maintain hope and purpose even as the days blurred together into an endless cycle of survival tasks, checking his solar stills, attempting to catch fish, repairing his raft, and scanning the horizon for any sign of rescue that seemed to grow less likely with each passing week. The sheer scale of this endurance test is part of what has made Callahan's story so widely respected and studied, not just as a tale of surviving a single disaster, but as a profound example of sustained human resilience under the most extreme conditions imaginable. 76 days is long enough for hope to fade and resurge many times over, long enough for the human body to be pushed to the brink of starvation, and long enough for isolation to test the very limits of mental stability. Yet Callahan endured all of this, drifting nearly 1,800 miles across one of the world's largest oceans, relying on nothing but his wits, his salvage tools, and an unyielding determination to survive. This extended period of adrift, survival stands as the central pillar of his story, transforming what could have been a brief tale of misfortune into one of the most extraordinary accounts of endurance and human willpower ever documented, one that continues to inspire and humble those who learn of it decades later. Resourcefulness became the defining survival skill that carried Steve Callahan through his 76 days adrift, and nowhere was this more evident than in the endless series of improvisations he was forced to invent simply to keep himself alive. Unlike a survival situation on land, where a person might find shelter, forage for food, or discover freshwater sources, the open ocean offers almost nothing freely. Every single resource Callahan needed had to be extracted, created, or coaxed from an environment that was fundamentally hostile to human life. His raft was not equipped with everything he needed for long-term survival, and so from the very first days of his ordeal, he had to become an inventor and engineer, constantly adapting the limited materials available to him into tools that could sustain his life one day at a time. Fishing became perhaps the most critical of these improvised survival tasks, and Callahan approached it with the mindset of a man who understood that failure meant starvation. Using his spear gun, he targeted the dorado and other fish that instinctively gathered beneath his raft, drawn to the shade and structure it provided in the otherwise featureless expanse of open water. But spearfishing from an unstable, constantly shifting inflatable raft was an enormously difficult task, requiring precision, patience, and timing that Callahan had to develop through trial and error, often at significant risk to himself and his fragile vessel. Every missed shot meant a lost spear or a damaged tip, and with his supply of equipment strictly limited, he had to learn quickly how to make each attempt count. When he did successfully spear a fish, he faced the added challenge of hauling it aboard without capsizing the raft or creating a puncture that could prove fatal, all while fending off the fish's thrashing and the ever-present danger of sharks drawn by the commotion and blood in the water. Beyond fishing, Callahan continuously found ways to repair and reinforce his deteriorating raft, a task that became an ongoing and exhausting necessity throughout his entire ordeal. The raft, never designed for such prolonged exposure to harsh marine conditions, began to develop leaks, weakened seams, and structural damage almost immediately. Callahan had to assess these problems with an engineer's eye, drawing on his background as a boat designer to identify solutions using whatever materials he had on hand. He patched holes, reinforced weak points, and constantly monitored the raft's buoyancy chambers, knowing that any failure in his repairs could result in a slow, or sudden, catastrophic sinking. This was not a one-time fix but a continuous process, as the combination of saltwater exposure, sun damage, and the physical stress of ocean swells meant that new problems arose constantly, requiring him to remain vigilant and adaptive every single day. His solar stills, essential for producing fresh drinking water, required similar ongoing attention and ingenuity to keep functioning. These devices were fragile and prone to failure, and as several of them broke down over the course of his journey, Callahan had to find ways to maximize the efficiency of the ones that remained, adjusting their positioning, protecting them from damage, and carefully managing the water they produced. He became intimately familiar with every flaw and quirk of his equipment, learning to anticipate problems before they became critical and developing workarounds that stretched the functional life of his gear far beyond what might have been expected. This constant cycle of monitoring, adjusting, and repairing became a full-time occupation, consuming much of his physical and mental energy each day, but it was this very vigilance that kept him alive when a less resourceful person might have succumbed to equipment failure and its consequences. Callahan's resourcefulness extended beyond simply maintaining his existing tools. He also had to think creatively about how to use his limited resources in new ways to solve unexpected problems. He devised methods for collecting rainwater during storms to supplement the unreliable output of his solar stills, and he found ways to use parts of the fish he caught beyond simply eating the meat, extracting every possible bit of nutritional value from each catch. He also had to manage his physical and mental state as a resource in itself, rationing his energy carefully, avoiding unnecessary exertion that might increase his need for food and water, while still maintaining the strength needed to fish, make repairs, and perform the tasks essential to his survival. This required a delicate balance, as being too conservative with his energy might mean missing crucial opportunities to catch food, while overexertion could accelerate the physical decline that malnutrition and dehydration were already causing. What made this resourcefulness so remarkable was not simply the individual solutions Callahan devised, but the sustained creativity and problem-solving mindset he maintained over such an extended period. Each day presented new challenges that could not have been fully anticipated or prepared for, and Callahan had to remain mentally flexible and inventive, drawing on his technical knowledge and natural ingenuity to address problems as they arose. This was survival not through brute force or luck alone, but through intelligent adaptation, careful resource management, and an unwavering commitment to finding solutions even when circumstances seemed impossible. His ability to repeatedly transform inadequate, damaged, or failing equipment into functional survival tools stands as one of the most instructive aspects of his story, offering a powerful demonstration of how human ingenuity, when combined with determination and technical skill, can overcome even the most extreme and prolonged challenges nature can present. This resourcefulness, sustained day after day for over 2.5 months, was ultimately just as vital to his survival as any single piece of equipment he carried with him into the raft. While the physical challenges of Steve Callahan's ordeal were extraordinary in themselves, it was arguably the psychological battle he fought each day that represented the truest test of his survival. Hunger, thirst, and the constant labor of repairing his raft and catching fish were brutal, but they were tangible problems with tangible solutions, tasks that could be approached with skill and effort. The war being waged inside his mind, however, was a far more elusive and dangerous enemy, one that had no clear strategy for victory and that threatened to undo him even when his body still had strength left to give. Isolation on this scale is difficult for most people to truly comprehend. Callahan was not simply alone for a few hours or even a few days. He was cut off from all human contact for over 2.5 months, surrounded by nothing but empty ocean in every direction, with no one to talk to, no one to share the burden of decision-making, and no one to offer even the smallest words of comfort or encouragement. This profound isolation created a psychological weight that pressed on him constantly, and he had to find ways to keep his mind occupied and his spirit intact even as the days blurred together into an exhausting cycle of survival tasks. The absence of human voices, of conversation, of the simple comfort of another person's presence, is something that can erode the mind slowly and insidiously, and Callahan had to actively fight against the creeping despair that threatened to take hold whenever he allowed himself to dwell too long on the hopelessness of his situation. He later spoke and wrote about how he began to develop something akin to a relationship with the sea creatures around him, particularly the dorado that gathered beneath his raft, finding in their presence a strange and fragile substitute for companionship, a way to feel less utterly alone in an environment that offered no other living connection. Fear was a constant companion throughout his ordeal, manifesting in many different forms depending on the circumstances of each day. There was the fear of sharks circling his raft, testing its fragile surface with exploratory bumps that reminded him constantly of how thin the barrier was between himself and being consumed. There was the fear that came with violent storms, when waves threatened to capsize his raft and the wind howled around him with a ferocity that made survival feel like a matter of pure chance rather than skill or preparation. There was the fear of his equipment failing entirely, of a solar still breaking beyond repair or a puncture in the raft that he could not patch, either of which could have meant a swift and inescapable death. But perhaps most insidious of all was the slower, quieter fear that built with each passing day, the fear that he might never be found, that his life might simply end out here in the vast indifference of the ocean, with no one ever knowing what had happened to him. Hopelessness threatened to overwhelm him at various points throughout his journey, particularly as the days stretched into weeks and then into months with no sign of rescue. Each ship that failed to spot him, each empty horizon at dawn, represented another small crushing of the hope he was trying desperately to maintain. It would have been easy, perhaps even understandable, for Callahan to have succumbed to despair, to have stopped fighting for survival when the odds seemed so overwhelmingly stacked against him. Yet he found ways to resist this pull toward hopelessness, drawing on an inner reservoir of discipline and willpower that allowed him to keep functioning, keep problem-solving, and keep believing that survival was still possible, even when logic might have suggested otherwise. Central to his psychological survival was the establishment of routine and discipline, structures that gave shape and purpose to days that might otherwise have dissolved into an undifferentiated haze of suffering. Callahan created systems for himself, regular tasks and checks that needed to be performed, from monitoring his solar stills to inspecting the raft for damage to attempting to fish at certain times of day. This routine served a purpose far beyond its practical necessity. It gave him something to focus on, a sense of control and agency in a situation that was otherwise defined by helplessness and unpredictability. By breaking his survival down into manageable daily tasks, he was able to avoid being paralyzed by the overwhelming scope of his situation, instead focusing his mental energy on the immediate and achievable goals that each day presented. He also had to manage his own thoughts and emotional state with the same careful attention he gave to his physical resources, recognizing that despair and panic were just as dangerous to his survival as thirst or starvation. This meant consciously working to maintain hope, even in the face of mounting evidence that his situation was dire, and finding small victories to hold onto, whether it was a successful catch, a functioning solar still, or simply surviving another day without catastrophe. His mental endurance was not a passive quality but an active, ongoing effort, a battle fought anew each day against the forces of isolation, fear, and hopelessness that constantly threatened to undermine his will to continue. Ultimately, it was this combination of discipline, routine, and sheer willpower that allowed Callahan to preserve his sanity and his determination across 76 days of extreme isolation and uncertainty. His physical survival skills would have meant little without the psychological fortitude to keep applying them day after day, week after week, in the face of circumstances that offered no guarantee of success. This mental endurance stands as perhaps the most profound lesson of his entire story, a testament to the extraordinary capacity of the human mind to resist despair and maintain purpose even in the most isolating and hopeless of circumstances, and it remains one of the most inspiring aspects of his survival that continues to resonate with readers and audiences long after his ordeal came to an end. Steve Callahan's story is far more than an account of a man who survived 76 days alone at sea. It is a profound testament to the depths of human resilience, the power of resourcefulness, and the extraordinary strength of the human spirit when confronted with circumstances that seem impossible to overcome. When his boat, the Napoleon Solo, sank beneath him in the darkness of the Atlantic, Callahan was left with nothing but a small inflatable raft, a handful of salvaged tools, and his own determination to survive. What followed was not simply a story of endurance, but a masterclass in adaptability, discipline, and the refusal to surrender to despair even when every circumstance seemed to demand it. Through his ingenuity, he transformed a broken spear gun and failing solar stills into instruments of survival, catching fish and collecting water with a precision born of necessity rather than convenience. Through his physical endurance, he withstood the relentless assault of sun, storm, and starvation, his body wasting away even as his will to live remained unbroken. And through his psychological fortitude, he confronted isolation and fear that few of us will ever have to imagine, finding ways to impose order and purpose on days that could easily have dissolved into hopelessness. Each of these elements, the disaster that began his ordeal, the tools that sustained him, the sheer length of his endurance, the resourcefulness that kept him alive, and the mental strength that held him together, worked in concert to produce one of the most remarkable survival stories in maritime history. What makes Callahan's journey so enduringly powerful is not simply that he survived, but how he survived. He did not have the luxury of ideal circumstances or perfect equipment. He had only what he could salvage, what he could repair, and what he could conjure through sheer determination and technical skill. In this sense, his story transcends the specific details of his ordeal at sea and becomes something universal, a reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary feats of endurance when they refuse to give up, when they approach each new obstacle not with despair but with the mindset of a problem solver determined to find a way forward. His eventual rescue near Guadeloupe, weakened and emaciated but alive, was not merely the end of a harrowing ordeal. It was the culmination of 76 days of unbroken will, a living demonstration of what the human body and mind can endure when survival itself becomes the only goal that matters. Callahan later shared his story so that others might understand not just the details of his experience, but the deeper truths it revealed about courage, adaptability, and hope in the face of overwhelming adversity. In closing, Steve Callahan's survival is a story that will continue to inspire generations, not because it was easy or because he had special advantages, but because he faced the unimaginable with resourcefulness, resilience, and an unshakable will to live. His journey reminds us all that even in our darkest and most uncertain moments, survival is possible when we refuse to stop fighting for it. Like and subscribe to watch more of the breathtaking legends of survival history and tales. That's all for now. See you later.